Examine the role of race within Ecuador's higher education system while comparing it to the United States is the goal I set to accomplish. Before I arrived to the country, I found an article within a magazine on the airplane about Afro-Mexicans' history. The author explained how she didn't know that there were as many black people as she thought in her country. She knew they were present, but not in as large of a quantity. She wanted to explore her Mexican roots so as if slaves, encourage her to capture this group's identity and tell their story. I was inspired. My goal is to examine Ecuador's higher education system and share the positive and negative truths about gaining access to their structural system. While talking to Janae, our tour guide, she explained how racism can be seen through neighboring countries like Peru due to Ecuador's economic system. Since Ecuador is a dollarized country, many of the neighboring countries see their system as profitable because the dollar is worth more. But when asked about racism in their education, health, and other systems, she was unclear. While in Cuenca, the tour guide seemed hesitant to answer any questions regarding race. The race makeup of the country, according to the tour guide from Cuenca, was 30% mixed white descendant, 60% mixed black, 9% Afro descendants, and 1% white. She explained how there isn't racism in Ecuador. It said it is classism. This raised a question for me. In the article, Rapture in the Maintenance of Indigenous Alterity, Crisis, Borders, and Race in Ecuador from 1941 to 2008, it discusses how the ideology of mestizos thinks that all Ecuadorians are equal because of their shared cultural and racial heritage. Also, that the indigenous/black people are lower class, and the higher class consisted of the white/mixed white people. My initial thought was that the mestizos were mixed blacks, and I used my biases in my experiences from the United States and assumed that even though mixed, they were still lower class and didn't have access. In the United States, throughout slavery, African Americans were forced to have sexual intercourse with white people, creating mixed children. Even though these children were mixed, they were still considered black, which is the one-drop rule, but had different opportunities if fairer skin. Race is embedded in the United States culture. It's in our health system, education, housing, etc. So it is benign to see that racism isn't embedded into others' countries' education, health, or other forms of systems. While in Guayaquil, I noticed that majority of their advertisements were not indigenous people, but of white people. This prompted me to ask Mark about why this is taking place. Mark explains it as it being associated with rich advertisement. It has been more white people traveling to Ecuador, and Ecuador is an indigenous country with a small Afro-Ecuadorian population. And since the group isn't seen very much, the likelihood of them being in ads are lower. Indigenous people were considered lower class many years ago. They didn't have access to opportunities that would aid in growth and financial security. She stated that they worked in fields which generates the economy. This is understandable, but why aren't they doctors, lawyers, or business owners? Why is it that they don't have access? What or who has been a factor into why they aren't in the middle or elite class if it's not about racism, but classism? According to Truha Veninte, their political and economic dependence on Europe and the United States is evident. The colonial structures of power remain, and the indigenous population continues to be marginalized. The local elites were mainly comprised of the mestizos, mixed European and indigenous population, that largely adopted Eurocentric views and power structure. The Latin American political economy has typically favored the maintenance of a hierarchical distribution of power, with the exclusion of the subordinate group. The tour guide explained the systematic and structural racism because of the stripping of access that other groups in power have, but tiptoed around it being about race. There is a pattern forming, but I didn't notice it at the time. Racism is something that the Ecuadorian country does not like to discuss. According to Truha Benite, The quality of education, especially higher education, was emphasized in the 1950s, but the mainstream discourses were not interested in the equality of educational opportunity, whereas Latin American indigenous peoples' knowledge was ignored and marginalized. The first university was a private one. There were a lot of gates and security, which I've noticed throughout the country. All of the universities had an open campus feel. When asked about social groups and organizations, there weren't many at all. The private school had a king and queen, and they were given scholarships if selected in their own offices as well. This reminded me of high school, and typically the election is based off popularity. In the United States, the importance of social organizations are valuable if used correctly. Sometimes students are active in more organizations than they can handle, which impact their academic career. I, I asked my host mom about the importance of higher education, and she explained that due to the reform, it is making public institutions free and has given a lot of Ecuadorians access to an education. All of her kids attended a private university, but for those who don't live in Cuenca, it is difficult to attend. This is one criticism that I see in their system. Just because it is free doesn't mean it is accessible. They do offer health care, dental, and psychological care to those students for free. They don't have the basic courses like our associate's degree. They go straight into their program. So if they decide they don't like it, they have to start over again and aren't able to switch majors as easy as we can. In class, we discussed the role of faculty due to the reform. In the article, Contemporary Higher Education Reform Ecuador, Implications for Faculty Recruitment, Hiring, and Retention by M. Amanda Johnson, she states, historically, the role of faculty in the Latin American university has been filled by part-time professionals who did not engage in research nor have doctoral degrees. Faculty are becoming the main and critical ingredient, but due to the low numbers of advanced degrees and low salary rates, being competitive to other professionals are limited. It is a push for faculty members to obtain their PhDs so that they can be marketable and competitive to other universities, typically in the United States and the European countries. But before the reforms, universities had a lot more of control because the government wasn't overseeing it and didn't have an input on what courses, what programs, etc. were being implemented at these universities. Faculty members aren't required to produce publications, and due to that, they have low numbers of those publications. The amount of teaching varies based off the status of that faculty member. Universities started to offer more classes for indigenous people and are required to have it in their languages. This was a barrier for indigenous people because they were not accustomed to the language of the local. Faculty research is impacted by the community because they need to approve the topic. So no academic freedom like the United States had. I see this as a barrier as well because it hinders what faculty members and what students would like to research. Before, only people who had connections attended universities, but those from lower economic classes has gained around 70% access to education after the reform. And just like the United States, Ecuadorians do see education as a means to social momentum. So does racism exist in Ecuador? I would say yes, in my opinion. It is hidden in the systems that are created, such as healthcare, public assistance, and access to education. Now, they do have public free institutions, but the means of attending, so getting to school every day, or having dorms, having meal plans like the United States is non-existent for those indigenous people that live on the coast. My personal reflection is, throughout this travel study, I struggled a lot with communicating with the locals, communicating with my host mom, trying to hail a taxi or trying to order something so simple as food. But what I learned is it's not about what you say, it's how you say it and how you communicate that to others. What I've learned is that the Ecuadorian people are so similar to the United States. We have a lot more in common than in difference. We struggle with some of the same issues that they struggle with. And, well, for me personally, I struggle with some of the issues that they struggle with having access to certain things. But what is promising is the steps that they are taking to improve their education system, and how that would impact their future will be tremendous. And in order to gain a cultural experience, in my opinion, it was important for me to get out of the classroom and to actually bargain with someone. For an example, when I was in Ghana, bargaining was a little easier because we all spoke English. But bargaining in Ecuador was a challenge because there was a language barrier. I enjoyed the freshness and the simplicity of their foods, of their clothing, of their traveling. I was able to get out of my phone, get out of a laptop, any technology, and really immerse myself into their culture. I gained a lot of insight when I was able to walk the streets and see that dogs roam the streets every day, but they're friendly. I was able to try new foods that I've never tried before because that was the only thing that was available. So I do recommend that in order to gain clarity and in order to become competent, it is important to immerse yourself in other people's culture. It's like taking a step in somebody else's shoes so you can understand the similarities and the differences and find ways to communicate and find ways to improve and better oneself. And for my professional career, I plan on studying more about race and how that impacts our systems and find ways to improve it if I can. And so this experience is definitely a foundation that I would use to break down any barriers that I can see. I plan on also working with students from different backgrounds, different statuses, racism, classism, structural racism, etc. And, and the goal is not to criticize a person for being different, but to highlight those differences and make that important and impactful for that student. And this symbol shows nothing but hope, inclusion, diversity, uniqueness, and I plan on using these same concepts in my future endeavors. And so this trip has been nothing but simply amazing because it will be the foundation of how I see and impact people around me.